In Hands-on 4, we'll finally connect to the real portfolio suggestion service, since the first version of it was made available. But we've just learned that the team behind the portfolio suggestion service forgot to tell us about a special message type called unsupported. So this unsupported message type our data model is not yet ready to handle. The portfolio suggestion service team currently use this unsupported response message type whenever they don't have a feature implemented yet, but that should not be the real purpose of the unsupported message type, because in the future they want to use it to signalize a legal denial of service. For example, due to sanctions imposed on a country of residence of the customer who wants to buy the assets. But anyway, we need to get ready to handle this new response type as soon as possible. In this hands-on, we'll learn the new response type by recording the real service traffic. And we will use the new response type to signalize sanctions on Iran. The portfolio suggestion service team insists that Iran is the only country on the sanctions list, so we'll see. In step number 1, we'll connect our virtual service to the real service endpoint. So let's copy it to clipboard. And then, after we have specified the real service endpoint, we can switch the virtual service to standby. In the standby mode, as we place the role of a man in the middle, it's just sitting there silently and forwarding requests to the real service and the responses of the real service back to the REST client. Then we'll take the request1 XML sample request, we'll try to invoke the real service and see the response. And then, to be able to see the new response type, we'll change the currency to check rounds and send the request again. First, we need to specify the real service URL. This is what you can do here in the service configuration section by clicking Edit. Currently, we already have the real service URL, so we can use it. And we will specify it here. I press OK. And now I will not restart simulation, but rather I'll press stop, which will switch our virtual service to the standby mode. Let me also switch message logging on so that we could explore the intercepted messages in more detail. As you can see here, in the runtime view summary, our portfolio suggestion service now runs in the standby mode. The data model accuracy is not showing because it doesn't make sense. It's a simulation metric. Let's now copy out the request 1 and invoke the virtual service. So it's very important to understand we don't change the URL here. We'll still invoke the virtual service. Just the virtual service will forward the request to the real service. And here on the virtual service level, we can always decide whether the virtual service will retrieve the result in simulation or whether we'll switch it to standby and the real service will retrieve the result. Okay. So this is the request 1, I'll press send, and now this is the result retrieved by the real service. You can see we again have about 4 to 8 assets on the output, so the result is no longer simulated, it comes from the real service. When I click send again, I receive a different set of assets. When I press send again I receive a different set of assets. We have tested 3 requests. In the designer, we'll therefore see 6 messages, 3 requests and 3 responses. Let's for a moment have a look inside the message log. I'll click Show Logged Messages. And now you can see all the 3 recorded request-response pairs show this symbol of standby. They were all logged during the standby mode. As I already mentioned, in the standby mode, SV is just a man in the middle. You can even use this drop-down to see how the request looked like when SV received it from the REST client and how the same request looked like when SV forwarded it to the real service. Equally, on the response side, we have the response retrieved from the real service and the response as we forwarded back to the client. Now let's go back to the REST client and change the currency to Czech crowns. Press send. Okay, so this is the new response type and we need to make it supported in our data model. So, as suggested in step 1, we'll switch our service to recording and learn the new type of response. After the recording is finished, we'll check we can see a new row in the learned data rule. I'll now switch to the learning mode. Learning mode works a lot like the standby mode. Just additionally, in the learning mode, SV records the messages and stores them in a cache. After you finish learning, SV will analyze the messages and store the results in the data model. Okay, so let's learn the same message that we tested here by clicking Send. 2 messages were recorded, but currently they will not be visible in the data model. For that to happen, you need to stop the learning, as we will analyze the recorded data and store it in the data model. So at this moment, when we have a look in the data model, in the learned data rule, you can see 1 row was recorded. When I show it in row detail, you can see it's exactly this new type of response, and the message is here. So currently, in our data model, we support these 3 types of response. The no content is to be able to produce an empty response. The portfolio suggestion, that's the XML that we normally generate. And now the unsupported response type. So we'll just keep the message here for the future. And we'll proceed with step number 3. We'll create a new rule called sanctions on Iran. And we'll make sure the service returns the unsupported response type whenever the request customer citizenship field has the value of Iran. Since this is a kind of an exceptional behavior, I will create the rule as topmost, because it should have the power to override whatever else would be normally produced. And here again, we'll express this request-response pair in terms of an if-then clause. So if on input we receive suggested portfolio structure, and if at the same time the citizenship is Iran, then match this request response row and execute the following action function to set the type to unsupported, and in the unsupported response, set the message to country is on a sanctions list. Press save, close. And since we still run in standby, we'll now switch to simulation, because again, we want to test the behavior in our data model. So let's press send. And currently, even though we specified the check crowns, we have again the usual output. And that's because in simulation we ignore this whole structure. So whatever we put in the currency will not make any difference in request matching. But what will make the difference is if we now specify the value of Iran in the citizenship field. As you can see, this new response type was retrieved. And since that was the last step of this exercise, we can click the dashboard, and it worked. Now, if I wanted to impose sanctions also on other countries, I would simply go to the data model, and let's perhaps improve the view here a little bit, since we already specified the functions. So now SV knows what columns are important. By the way, if you want to select different columns, you can just go here, select columns configuration, and you select the type of request or response. You can expand or collapse the view, select different columns, and so on. So if I wanted to have sanctions on other countries as well, I would simply copy this row and paste it multiple times, and in this way we can impose sanctions on Mordor, Antarctica, and we restart the simulation. We can go to our REST client, and we can see that for Spain we get the normal response, but for Mordor, as well as for Antarctica, we get these countries on a sanctions list now. And you can obviously build your conditions based not just on a single field, but on a combination of many fields. Like for example here, by default, all the columns receive the is function, even the technical parameters here. But by the way, isn't it strange that we have never seen this unsupported currency message on output? I think we didn't see it even when we specified the exact same parameters as mentioned here. Let's perhaps test it. And since I don't remember based on what we specified the request, I'll simply export it from our data model. You can get the raw message back by this export functionality. You just select the rows and the output directory. Let's export it on desktop. We click export. And now on my desktop, you can see 4 exported files. The headers are exported separately from the body. So this is the raw request that we used to learn the unsupported message type. Let's copy it here, press send, and indeed you can see for this exact same request that we learned here in the learned data row, we don't get the unsupported message, we get the standard response. And the question is why? And this is exactly what we'll look into in Hands-on 5 simulation troubleshooting. The issue is that the virtual service is getting more complex than we expected, and we are not sure why it returns certain response. The behavior seems to be incorrect to us, and the mitigation is to use the simulation report and the message log to analyze the virtual service behavior to be able to fix it. We already switched the service to simulation. We used the right request. So now it's up to us to use the troubleshooting tools to investigate why the unsupported message is not getting returned for the exact same request that we used to record it. So again, why this request that is here, that was recorded here to the learn data rule, doesn't return this unsupported currency message, and why it rather returns the normal output. So as the first step, let's go to the virtual service homepage by double-clicking the name, and let's turn on the simulation report. In the message log, you can see we logged quite a lot of messages in standby mode, then during learning. By the way, this is another place from which we could take the request that we used to record and learn this unsupported structure. Then we have a lot of messages recorded in simulation, but so far we haven't recorded any simulation report because we have just switched it on. So let me press send again. And now the last simulated request response pair has this simulation report attached. From this simulation report, we can see the simulation algorithm proceeded in 2 cycles. This is cycle 1 and this is cycle 2. You can also see that in cycle 1, this learned data row actually matched because one action function was executed here. Only if a row matches, the action functions can be executed. So this learn data rule was actually executed. So let's click here to see the details. We could drill down through the data to see details of individual fields being generated. For example, this is the first item from this standard response. And from the simulation report, we can see the values were generated from the rule with priority 6. When I click it, it will actually show me the exact step in cycle 1, samples from documentation rule that has the priority of 6, as we can see from the data model. In cycle 1, when processing the samples from documentation rule, the name field of this first asset in this array, the name was changed from not present to Bundesrepublik Deutschland. Okay, similar for this field. you can go through the data, and for every single field you can find out which of the rules was responsible for generating the value. For example, here for this KYC name, we can see the value of John was, when I click it, was copied from request to response within this copy data to customer rule with priority number 5 that you can see here. So during simulation algorithm cycle 1, when processing this copy customer data to response rule, the name here was changed from not present to John. So not only you can investigate why certain rule didn't match, like here, for example, sanctions on Iran, why it didn't match, because the citizenship had a different value. When we click here, we can see the citizenship field is indeed the cause why this particular row didn't match. And that was expected because in the citizenship field we used Spain, but for this row to match you would have to have Iran. But when we go back to the simulation report homepage, let's investigate the original question: why this learned data, in spite of matching, why didn't it produce the unsupported element? So what's wrong here is this type. This type should be unsupported. It shouldn't be this portfolio suggestion. So the question is, which rule was responsible for setting this portfolio suggestion type instead of the unsupported type? And when we click here, we can see it's rule number 2. So it's actually this rule, set asset count to 50. Isn't that strange? Well, let's go to the set asset count to 50 rule. And let's display this in row detail. And indeed, you can see there is this type field with set function and this value. So actually this rule is responsible for setting the type to portfolio suggestion. And the question is, why did this rule win over our learn data rule? And the answer is simple, because it has the higher priority. So if we actually want the learn data rule to win, then we have to move it up so that its priority is higher than this set asset count to 50 rule. When we now restart simulation and click send, you can see for the first time that this unsupported currency message was retrieved. And that also means we can try to pass the next checkpoint. And not only it worked, but the dashboard also executed checks for the previous hands-ons to make sure that we haven't broken anything.